So if you have did it unto the least of these, you have done it unto me. Those are the words of Jesus. And he's talking about this in the book of Matthew, chapter 25, verse 40. And he's talking about people who are hungry, people who are thirsty, people who are in all types of situation, and somebody ministers to them. Now, interesting enough, this whole teaching comes from something Jesus talked about in a sermon. And Matthew tells us about how that in this sermon, Jesus had gathered together all of the nations of the world. And this is after he had returned in his glory. And he began to separate the sheep from the goats. And then he began to talk about those who are faithful, who are the sheep. In other words, the sheep, he says, are on the right hand, and they are the people who are faithful. The goats on the left hand, and I said yesterday on the broadcast, I'm not sure exactly why God talks about the goats in such a negative way, and I just happen to have some goats. And one of the gentlemen in my church, I gave this question to the congregation. He began to tell me about how that sheep are humble and they're docile, but a goat, if you know anything about goats, they will butt you, and they are obstinate. And I got a little goat, and he'll lay it on you if you're not careful. So maybe that has something to do with it. But as Scripture begins to lay it out about how that there's somebody who's hungry, and you ignore them. Somebody that's thirsty, you ignore them. Somebody that's sick or suffering, you ignore them. And he says, these people who are described as being the goats, he said, basically, they're not going to go to heaven. Now, that's pretty extreme, but it does tell you the heart of God. Now, I talked about last week the story that Jesus also told about the man that we refer to as the Good Samaritan. The Scripture says he was just a certain Samaritan on the road to Jericho, the dark and bloody way. And he sees this man in the ditch. But previous to this man, I'm talking about the Good Samaritan arriving here, there were two others that Jesus tells us about that had just passed on. And they just ignored the man in the ditch. Well, from the story that Jesus tells here, these two men who were religious figures, people who had the responsibility for the spiritual condition of the people, Jesus was saying, they're goats. They're goats. Because they did not have compassion to help minister to their fellow man. They did not have the heart of ministry. And I believe it's very relevant in our day and age that we understand that in the midst of all of the turmoil, in the midst of all the things that we see and experience, we must love those who God loved, and that's humanity. This is Pastor Jack King with the gospel on the radio broadcast.